The night air was dry and heavy with smoke, the kind that clung to skin and clothes long after the fire was gone. Somewhere beyond the hills, a coyote howled, its cry echoing through the emptiness, like a ghost remembering what it had lost. The plains stretched wide under a bruised sky, the stars faintly trembling above the horizon. A column of soldiers had ridden in earlier that evening, their horses tired, their tempers short, their commander colder than the wind that swept through the valley. The colonel's orders were clear and cruel, and his men knew better than to question him. But something about this night felt different, as if the land itself was holding its breath. A woman stood outside a small wooden cabin, clutching her 2 children close. The cabin sat on the edge of what had once been a peaceful Apache village, before war and vengeance turned everything to ash. Her hair was tangled, her eyes wide and afraid, but her voice was calm when she whispered to her children to stay quiet. Behind her, the faint flicker of lanterns cast moving shadows across the cracked ground. The soldiers were getting closer. The woman knew what that meant. She had seen villages burn before, had watched the flames take everything and leave nothing but silence. But this time, the fire was meant for her. The colonel rode at the front, his coat brushed with dust, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He had fought long enough to stop seeing people as people. Orders were orders, and mercy was not part of the trade. The war with the Apaches had left scars that ran deep, too deep for peace, too wide for forgiveness. He had lost men in ambushes, seen caravans torn apart, and heard stories of vengeance that made even the hardest soldiers keep their rifles close at night. So when the scouts found the woman and her children hiding near the old Apache lands, the colonel decided to make an example. "Burn her along with her children," he said, his voice steady and without hesitation. The words dropped into the air like stones into a still pond. The soldiers looked at one another, unsure. Some shifted in their saddles, uneasy. It wasn't that they hadn't done terrible things before. War had changed them all. But this felt different. The woman was no warrior, and her children were small, too small to understand what was happening. Yet the colonel's eyes showed no trace of doubt. To him, this was justice. To the others, it felt like something else entirely, something darker. From the ridge overlooking the valley, a lone Apache warrior watched the scene unfold. His horse stood silent beside him, nostrils flaring with the scent of smoke. He had seen the soldiers' trail long before they reached the cabin. He had followed from a distance, knowing what men like them could do when fear and hatred guided their hearts. The warrior's face was marked with dust and sorrow. He had lost his family to soldiers once, long ago when he was a boy hiding in the canyons. Now, the sight of that woman and her children below stirred something in him that he thought had died years ago. The soldiers surrounded the cabin, torches in hand. The woman stepped forward, holding her children behind her. She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't even speak. Her silence unnerved them more than any scream could have. The colonel dismounted, boots sinking into the dry earth. "You should have stayed where you belong," he said, his tone flat and final. One of the soldiers hesitated, glancing at the children. The colonel's glare silenced him before he could say a word. The torches flared bright, and the first drop of fire fell against the old wooden wall of the cabin. The dry timber caught almost instantly, the flames licking upward like hungry tongues. The heat rose, crackling, alive. The woman's eyes met the colonel's for a long moment. There was no hate there, only a deep and tired sadness that even he could not look away from. Then she turned her gaze to the horizon, as if waiting for something or someone. The Apache warrior's hand tightened on the reins. Every instinct told him to stay hidden. The soldiers were many, he was one. But something deep within him stirred a voice older than fear, older than war. He thought of the stories his grandfather had told him by the fire, stories of honor and the spirit of the land. They said that a man who watched evil and did nothing became part of it. The warrior could not let that happen again. He moved fast, guiding his horse down the slope. The animal's hooves struck the ground with quiet power, sending up dust in his wake. The soldiers didn't see him until he was almost upon them. A shout went up, rifles raised, but by then it was too late. The warrior rode straight into the circle of firelight, his shadow stretching long across the dirt. His horse reared and the torches wavered in startled hands. The colonel turned, his expression hardening. But there was something in the warrior's eyes that froze him for a moment, a wild courage that no order could break. "Stop," the warrior said, his voice calm but carrying across the crackle of the flames. The soldiers hesitated again. The colonel barked for them to fire, but not a single shot came. The firelight flickered over faces torn between duty and conscience. The woman was still standing near the cabin, her children clutching her skirt, watching with wide eyes. The warrior dismounted slowly. His hands opened to show he carried no rifle, only the long knife at his side and the strength of his will. He walked forward, each step steady, deliberate. The colonel's jaw tightened. "You're too late," he said. "This is military justice." "Justice," the warrior replied quietly. "There is no justice in burning the helpless." For a heartbeat, the only sound was the wind, whispering through the dry grass. The fire crackled louder, the smoke rising higher into the night. The colonel's men looked to him, waiting for a command. Something in his face shifted, an old memory, perhaps, or a faint echo of guilt, but he pushed it aside. "Stand down," the colonel ordered finally, though his voice wavered just slightly. The warrior stepped closer to the woman, his gaze never leaving the colonel. The two men stood facing each other, two worlds divided by pain and pride. The soldiers lowered their torches, uncertain. The colonel reached for his revolver, but the warrior's hand moved faster. He didn't draw his knife, didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "If you do this, the land will never forgive you." The colonel froze. There was something in the warrior's tone, calm, yet carrying the weight of something larger than them both, that made even the fire seem too quiet for a moment. The woman held her breath. The soldiers waited. The horses shifted nervously, sensing the storm that was about to break. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, beyond the hills, another sound rose, the distant beat of hooves, many of them. The colonel turned his head sharply, eyes narrowing. The warrior glanced over his shoulder, but didn't move. The sound grew louder, closer, until it rolled across the valley like thunder. The soldiers gripped their rifles again, unsure whether it was friend or foe approaching. The colonel's hand hovered near his gun. His face caught between anger and fear. The warrior didn't move. The firelight flickered between them, throwing wild shadows on the ground. The woman took her children into her arms and stepped back, eyes darting toward the dark horizon, and then, just as the first shapes began to appear through the dust silhouettes of riders against the firelit sky, the colonel spoke, his voice low and tight. "Who are they?" The warrior's expression didn't change. His answer came soft and steady. "They are the ones who still remember what was taken." The colonel turned toward the sound, his heart pounding as the rumble of hooves closed in. The flames behind him climbed higher, painting the night in gold and blood. And in that suspended moment, between vengeance and redemption, between life and ruin, the world seemed to hold its breath once more. The pounding of hooves drew nearer, their rhythm carrying a strange energy that made every soldier tighten his grip on his rifle. The colonel's jaw clenched as dust swirled in from the east, veiling the riders in a shroud of gold and gray. The Apache warrior stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he already knew who was coming. The woman pressed her children close, her heart beating fast, torn between hope and fear. The night crackled with tension. As the riders emerged through the haze, the soldiers' unease deepened. They weren't army men, at least, not by the look of them. Their horses moved with purpose, and their faces, half covered by scarves and shadow, carried the calm of men used to surviving on their own terms. The colonel stepped forward, hands still near his holster, and called out for them to identify themselves. But no answer came. The riders slowed, their leader raising a hand for silence. The Apache warrior didn't move an inch. His gaze met that of the man in front, and something passed between them, a memory, a promise, or perhaps the weight of an old debt. The colonel's men glanced at one another. They had never seen anything like this before. The war had scattered people, In every direction, soldiers. Scouts, traitors, outlaws, but there was something about these newcomers that didn't fit any single story. They looked like survivors of the borderlands, those who lived between two worlds and belonged to neither. Their clothes were worn but sturdy, their weapons carried with quiet confidence. The colonel's voice rose again, firm but uncertain now. This is military ground. State your business. Leader of the riders dismounted slowly. His boots met the earth with a sound that seemed to echo louder than it should. His eyes, sharp beneath his wide-brimmed hat, moved from the burning cabin to the woman and then to the colonel. Your wars brought too many fires to this land, he said quietly. Best you don't light another. The colonel's mouth hardened. I take orders from Washington, not from strangers in the desert. The man gave a faint, humorless smile. Washington doesn't know this land. It never did. Behind him, a few of the riders nodded in agreement. Among them were both white men and native scouts, Apache Navajo, and others who had fought on every side of every border until sides no longer meant anything. Their faces were lined with sun and dust, but their eyes carried something rare, purpose. The woman stared at them, confused. She had heard stories of these mixed bands who roamed the edge of the frontier, neither outlaws nor heroes. Some said they were deserters. Others said they protected those caught between the army and the tribes. Whatever they were dangerous to anyone who thought power could be taken by fire and bullets alone. The Apache warrior took a step forward, his voice quiet but steady. You shouldn't have come here, he said to the leader. They'll see you as enemies. The man looked back at him. We've been called worse. The colonel's patience thinned. He turned toward his men. Surround them. No one moves without my command. The soldiers hesitated, unsure whether to obey. The wind had shifted, and so had their hearts. The colonel's words no longer carried the same certainty they once did. The Apache warrior glanced toward the burning cabin, the flames beginning to die into embers. Enough people have burned, he said quietly. The colonel's temper broke. You're defending a woman who's been sheltering enemies. You think I don't know what this is? He pointed at her. They're hiding among settlers now, pretending to be harmless. I've lost too many men to that lie. The woman stepped forward, trembling but defiant. I was hiding from both sides, she said softly. The soldiers took my husband. The tribes burned our farm. I have nowhere left. Her words carried through the air like the cry of something fragile yet unbroken. Even the soldiers lowered their rifles slightly. For the first time, doubt flickered in the colonel's eyes. But before he could answer, one of the younger soldiers spoke up from behind him. Sir, if she's telling the truth? The colonel spun on him sharply. Do you question my order, Private? The soldier hesitated, his voice small. No, sir. Just maybe there's been enough killing. Silence fell again. The colonel's hand tightened around his revolver, but he didn't draw it. The Apache warrior stood unmoving, waiting to see which way this night would turn. The leader of the new riders took a step forward, his tone calm but edged with warning. Colonel, you've made your point. If you burn this woman, you'll make an enemy of every soul who still remembers mercy. The colonel's glare hardened. Mercy is what gets men killed out here. Or maybe it's the lack of it, the man said. The two locked eyes, neither willing to yield. The air between them was thick enough to cut. The woman's children clung to her dress, eyes wide, sensing how fragile everything had become. Then, from the north, came the faint sound of another horn of military call. The colonel turned his head sharply. Reinforcements, perhaps? Or a warning? The riders exchanged glances. The Apache warrior's hand brushed the hilt of his knife, not to attack, but to prepare. He could feel the land stirring, as if the earth itself had grown tired of blood. The colonel looked back at the woman. For a fleeting moment, his expression softened. He had a daughter once, before the war hardened his heart. The memory flickered across his face before he buried it again. Take your children and go, he said at last, his voice low. If I see you again, there'll be no second mercy. The woman didn't move at first, unsure if she could trust the words. The Apache warrior nodded toward the open field. Go, he told her quietly. She hesitated, then gathered her children and ran into the dark. her figure swallowed by the tall grass and shadows. The colonel turned back to the warrior. "And as for youth, this isn't over," the warrior said softly. "It never is." The colonel mounted his horse, signaling his men to move out. They followed, weary and confused, leaving the smoldering ruins behind. When the sound of hooves faded into the distance, only the Apache warrior and the riders remained in the valley. The leader of the riders looked at the warrior with quiet respect. "You risked your life for someone you don't know." The warrior looked toward the dark horizon. "No one's a stranger when the fire reaches their home." The man nodded slowly. "The colonel won't let this rest. He's a man who believes he's fighting for order even when he's feeding chaos." The warrior's gaze was steady. "He's not the first." They stood together in silence for a while, listening to the wind carry the last hiss of dying flames. The land was vast and still, holding the echoes of everything that had been lost to pride and war. The riders began to make camp nearby, speaking in low voices, their movements practiced and quiet. The warrior helped them gather what was left from the cabin scraps of wood, a few scattered belongings. As he did, he found a small wooden carving among the ashes, shaped like a bird. He brushed the soot away and held it for a moment before setting it aside. Later, when the campfire burned low, the leader of the riders sat beside him. "You knew the colonel once, didn't you?" he asked. The warrior didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the stars. "I saw him years ago," he said finally. "When I was a boy, his soldiers came to my village. They said it was for peace, but peace never came." The man nodded, the firelight flickering across his face. "He's chasing ghosts now. The army calls it duty, but I think it's just regret." The warrior said nothing. Somewhere out in the darkness, an owl called, soft and lonely. He thought about the woman and her children, wondering if they had found a place where the night couldn't reach them. Before dawn, the riders packed their gear. The warrior saddled his horse again, glancing back at the valley one last time. The ashes still smoldered faintly, glowing like old memories refusing to fade. The leader of the riders turned toward him. "You could come with us," he offered. "We could use someone like you." The warrior looked at him, then toward the east, where the sky was just beginning to pale. "Not yet," he said quietly. "There's still something I have to see." "What's that?" the man asked. The warrior's gaze was distant. "The place where this all began." The man nodded slowly, understanding without more words. The warrior mounted his horse and rode off toward the rising sun, the wind carrying the faint smell of smoke behind him. The land stretched open before him, scarred but alive, vast but unforgiving. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the colonel was already planning his next march, and the echoes of his command still haunted the wind. The warrior rode on, not knowing where the road would end, only that the story was far from over. The morning sun climbed slowly over the hills, brushing the dry plains with a pale gold light. The Apache warrior rode alone now, his horse moving at a steady pace through the brittle grass. The wind carried the faint scent of smoke still clinging to his clothes, a reminder of the night before. Behind him, the land lay scarred and silent, holding the memory of what had almost happened. Ahead of him stretched miles of uncertainty. He didn't know where the woman had gone or what the colonel would do next, but he knew the fight was far from finished. The colonel's words replayed in his mind as he rode. They weren't just the voice of one man. They were the echo of a nation convinced it could tame the land by fire. The warrior had seen it again and again. Settlers pushing westward, soldiers marching with flags and fear, promises made and broken like dry branches underfoot. But this time was different. This time, the colonel had shown a cruelty that had burned something deeper than the cabin. It had lit a spark of defiance that could not easily be put out. As the sun rose higher, the warrior came upon an old trading post near the edge of the river. The place was half abandoned, its wooden walls sun-bleached and warped, but smoke curled faintly from a chimney. He dismounted, leading his horse toward the entrance. Inside, an old man with a gray beard and weathered eyes was sorting through sacks of grain. When he looked up, his gaze held a quiet recognition. "Haven't seen you since the last skirmish near the border," the trader said. Thought you might have gone north?" The warrior shook his head. "Not yet." The old man nodded slowly. "Word travels fast. The colonel's been stirring up trouble again. They say he's looking for something or someone." The warrior stayed silent. The trader studied him for a moment, then lowered his voice. "You stopped him from burning that woman, didn't you?" The warrior's eyes met his, steady but tired. "Someone had to." The trader leaned closer. "You made yourself a target. The colonel doesn't forgive disobedience. Not from his own men, not from anyone." He hesitated, glancing toward the door. "There's talk that he's gathering more troops down south. He's planning something bigger." The warrior didn't flinch. "What kind of plan?" "Some say it's a campaign to wipe out what's left of the Apache villages near the canyon," the trader said. "He calls it cleansing the frontier, but I think it's revenge." The words hit like a stone to the chest. The warrior's grip tightened on his saddle strap. That canyon wasn't just another patch of land, it was where his people had once lived, where his father had fought and fallen years ago. If the colonel meant to burn it next, the bloodshed would be far worse than before. The old man sighed. "You can't face him alone, son. You'll need allies." "I'll find them," the warrior said quietly. He left the post and rode toward the canyon, following the river as it wound through the open land. The day grew hotter, the air thick with dust and the sound of cicadas. He stopped only once to let his horse drink, his eyes always scanning the horizon. Every shadow looked like a rider, every gust of wind like an omen. He knew the colonel would not let him disappear icily, far behind him. At the army's outpost, the colonel stood by a table marked with maps and red ink. His hands rested heavily on the wood as he studied the lines that traced across the land. His adjutant, a young lieutenant, entered the tent and waited for orders. "Any word on the woman?" the colonel asked without looking up. "None, sir. The scouts lost her trail near the river, but they found tracks heading west, likely the Apache's horse." The colonel's jaw tightened. "He's leading her away, buying her time. He thinks he can outsmart me." The lieutenant hesitated. "Sir, the men are uneasy. Some of them believe what happened at the cabin was unnecessary." The colonel turned slowly, his gaze sharp. "You think I care what they believe?" "No, sir," the lieutenant said quickly. "It's just if we keep burning villages, there won't be anyone left to fight." The colonel stared at him for a long moment before speaking. "You're young. You still think this land can be tamed with kindness? It can't. Every treaty we sign, they break. Every promise we make, they twist. The only thing they understand is fear." The lieutenant swallowed his reply, standing stiffly as the colonel turned back to his map. His finger traced the line toward the canyon. "We'll march there by week's end," he said, "and we'll end this." As night fell, the warrior reached the canyon's edge. The cliffs rose high and red against the fading light, casting long shadows across the valley below. He dismounted and walked to a ledge overlooking the land that had once been alive with laughter and song. Now it was quiet, save for the rustle of wind through the sagebrush. He could still see the ruins of old dwellings carved into the rock, half buried by time. He knelt, pressing his hand to the earth, feeling the heartbeat of the land beneath his palm. It was there that he met another Traveler young woman from one of the nearby settlements. She was gathering herbs near the river and stopped when she saw him. Her eyes held both curiosity and caution. "You're Apache," she said softly. He nodded. "My father told stories about your people," she said. "He said they once protected this land." "They still try," the warrior replied. She looked at him for a moment, then asked, "You came here for the colonel, didn't you?" "I came because he means to destroy what's left," he said, "and because too many people have forgotten what was sacred." The woman hesitated, then spoke again. "There's a wagon camp 2 miles from here. Traders, farmers, a few families who left the army's protection. They're afraid too. If you tell them what's coming, they might help." The warrior studied her face, searching for any hint of deceit. But her eyes were clear, her tone steady. "Why help me?" he asked. "Because my brother died fighting under that colonel," she said quietly. "And I don't want his name tied to more burning." The warrior nodded. "Show me the camp." They rode together through the dim light, reaching a small settlement hidden among the rocks. Fires burned low in the center, casting faint orange circles over weary faces. The people there looked up as they arrived, men, women, and children who carried the tired look of those who had lost everything but the will to survive. A man stepped forward, tall and broad-shouldered, his hair streaked with gray. "Who is this?" he asked the woman. "He's here because of the colonel," she said. "He knows what's coming." The man's eyes narrowed. "And why should we believe him?" The warrior dismounted and spoke plainly. "Because I've seen what he does. Because I was there when he tried to burn an innocent family." He paused, letting his words settle over them. "He's marching here next. If you stay, he'll bring fire to your door too." The crowd murmured uneasily. Some looked skeptical, others afraid. The gray-haired man crossed his arms. "And what do you expect us to do?" "Fight soldiers with our bare hands." The warrior met his gaze. "You know this land better than they do? You know where to hide, where to strike if you must? If you stand together, you can make it hard for him to destroy you." The man looked around at the others, uncertainty flickering across his face. "And if we run? Then you'll run forever," the warrior said quietly. A heavy silence followed. Then the woman spoke again. "He's right. The army won't stop until every place like this is gone." Finally, the gray-haired man nodded slowly. "If what you say is true, we'll need to be ready. But if you lead us into a trap, Apache, you'll answer for it." The warrior's expression didn't change. "If I lead you wrong, I won't live long enough to answer for anything." Through the night, they made plans. Some gathered supplies, others scouted the trails leading into the canyon. The warrior helped them find safe passages through the rocks, paths only those born of the land could know. Yet even as he worked, a shadow hung over him. He could almost feel the colonel's presence pressing closer. Like the heat before a storm. Far away, the colonel sat by his campfire, the map beside him, the wind tugging at his coat. He stared into the flames, his mind filled with ghosts, his lost daughter, the men he'd buried, the endless war that no victory could satisfy. Somewhere deep down, a quiet voice asked if he'd gone too far, but he silenced it the way he always did, with purpose. He told himself this was the price of control, in the dark canyon. The warrior looked toward the horizon, the sky bruised with clouds. He could see the faint glow of distant fires to the south where the colonel's men were gathering. The land between them was still and waiting. The fight hadn't begun yet, but both men knew it was coming. And when it did, it would not be about one woman or one village anymore. It would be about everything the frontier had taken and everything it still refused to give back. The sky turned a dull red by morning, and the wind carried the smell of rain and smoke together. The Apache warrior stood on a high ridge overlooking the canyon, watching as the clouds thickened over the land. Below him, the small camp of settlers and riders stirred awake. Horses whinnied softly, men whispered plans, and fires were stoked for what might be their last meal before everything changed. The tension in the air was so strong it seemed even the earth could feel it. Everyone knew the colonel's army was coming, though no one knew exactly when. The warrior had spent the night mapping out the ridges and narrow paths that wound through the canyon. He knew the land like a living thing, its strengths, its hidden turns, its places of safety, and its traps. The settlers followed his lead, though fear shadowed every face. The gray-haired man who had doubted him now stood as his second, moving among the people with a steady hand. Even the children seemed to sense something was coming. They didn't laugh or run that morning. They just sat near their mother's, eyes wide, listening to the wind. The young woman who had brought the warrior to the camp approached him as he tightened his saddle. "Do you think they'll fight?" she asked quietly. "They'll have to," he said. "The colonel doesn't come to talk." She looked toward the horizon. The sun was breaking through the clouds in streaks of gold, but the beauty of it only deepened the dread that hung over them. "He's a man chasing ghosts," she said softly. "You can't reason with that." The warrior nodded. "Then we don't reason. We endure." By midday, a scout came riding fast from the south, dust trailing behind his horse. He slid from the saddle and shouted, "They're coming." 2 miles out, maybe less. The camp erupted in movement. Men grabbed rifles, women gathered the children and food, and the warrior climbed the ridge again to look toward the plains. The colonel's army stretched across the open land. A line of men and horses shimmering in the heat. Flags fluttered faintly, rifles gleamed under the light, and the steady rhythm of boots carried a kind of grim music. The colonel rode in front, his expression unreadable, his uniform spotless despite the dust. Behind him, wagons followed, carrying supplies, ammunition, and the tools of fire. He wasn't just here for a fight. He was here to erase what stood in his way. The warrior returned to the camp and gave quick orders. "Hide the women and children in the ravine. The rest of you spread out across the cliffs. Don't waste bullets. Let them come close." His voice carried a calm authority that made the others move without question. The settlers took their positions behind rocks and brush, their hands shaking as they loaded rifles. The young woman helped lead the children into hiding, but before she disappeared into the shadows, she looked back at the warrior. He gave her a nod, steady, a promise. From the canyon rim, the first sounds of the approaching army grew louder, the clatter of bridles, the low murmur of voices, the creak of wagons. Dust rose like smoke in the distance. The gray-haired man crouched beside the warrior. "You think this will work?" he whispered. The warrior's gaze stayed fixed on the approaching line. "It has to." The colonel's column entered the mouth of the canyon just as the sun dipped lower, casting long, jagged shadows. The place was quiet. He halted his men and scanned the rocky walls. "Stay alert," he ordered. "They're here." The lieutenant rode beside him, uneasy. "Sir, if we press through the canyon, we'll be vulnerable. It's narrow." "That's why we move fast," the colonel said. "If they're hiding here, we'll flush them out." He turned to his men. "Advance." The soldiers began to move, the sound of boots and hooves echoing off the stone. The wind shifted, carrying the faint creak of leather and the smell of gunpowder. From the cliffs above, the warrior watched them enter like ants, crawling into a trap. He waited, every muscle tense. Then he gave the signal. A single shot rang out. It echoed down the canyon like thunder, followed by a cascade of gunfire from both sides. The soldiers ducked and scattered, their formation breaking. Bullets struck the rocks, sending shards flying. Horses reared, screaming. The colonel shouted for order, but the canyon swallowed his voice. Smoke rose in thin spirals, and the air filled with the sharp scent of powder. The warrior moved along the ridge, firing, signaling, guiding. He didn't fight for blood or revenge. He fought to keep the colonel from reaching the heart of the canyon, where the families waited. The settlers fought beside him, fear burning into something fiercer. The gray-haired man reloaded beside a fallen boulder, shouting to hold the line. For a moment, it seemed they might drive the soldiers back, but the colonel had fought too many battles to break easily. He regrouped his men behind the wagons, shouting orders that cut through the chaos. "Bring up the rifles. Aim for the high ground." His voice was iron. The soldiers raised their weapons, firing upward into the cliffs. Bullets struck close, sending the defenders diving for cover. The warrior ducked behind a rock, his breath sharp. He could hear the colonel's voice below, steady, commanding, relentless. "Push forward. Burn the ridge if you have to." The words made his stomach tighten. He looked to the far end of the canyon, where the wagons had stopped. Soldiers were unloading barrels of oil and torches. They meant to smoke them out. He ran along the ridge toward the gray-haired man. "They're bringing fire," he said. The man's eyes widened. "We can't hold if they burn the cliffs." The warrior scanned the land, his mind racing. "We don't hold. We move." He signaled for the defenders to fall back toward a second ridge that curved behind the canyon wall. The movement was risky, one wrong step and they'd be caught in the open. But staying meant being trapped. He motioned for the settlers to retreat first, covering their escape with gunfire. The colonel saw the shift and urged his men forward, his voice cutting through the haze. "Now, finish it." The battle turned desperate. Smoke rose in thick plumes as the soldiers set fire to the brush. The canyon filled with a red glow that flickered across the rocks like a living thing. The air grew hot, choking. The warrior coughed, eyes burning, but kept moving, helping the others find the narrow path through the rock stop below. The colonel dismounted, his boots sinking into ash and dust. He walked forward slowly, revolver in hand, scanning the cliffs. "You think you can run forever?" He called out, "This land belongs to the army now." His voice echoed through the canyon. But there was something brittle in it, something that betrayed the strain behind his calm. He was a man chasing an enemy that refused to stand still, and it was driving him deeper into the very land he wanted to control. The warrior reached the second ridge and turned to look down. Through the smoke, he could see the colonel's men moving like shadows, their torches flickering as the fire spread. The settlers had reached the ravine with the women and children, but the soldiers were close behind. If they found that path, there would be no stopping them. The young woman appeared beside him, her face streaked with soot. "They're cornering us," she said. He looked toward the far side of the canyon where the river cut through the rock. "There's another way out," he said, "but it's dangerous." She followed his gaze. "Then we'll take it." Below them, the colonel climbed higher onto the rocks, determined to see for himself what his men could not. The smoke swirled around him, and for a moment, he thought he saw a movement of figure watching him from above, calm and silent. It was the warrior. Their eyes met through the haze, and time seemed to stop. The colonel raised his revolver, aiming upward. "You should have stayed out of this," he shouted. The warrior didn't move. His expression was unreadable, almost sorrowful. The colonel fired, the shot echoing across the canyon. The bullet struck the rock beside the warrior, shattering stone. The warrior dropped low, sliding behind cover. The sound stirred the canyon into chaos again, men shouting, fire crackling, the river roaring below. The warrior signaled for the settlers to move toward the river passage. The gray-haired man took the lead, guiding the families down the narrow slope. The warrior stayed behind, covering their retreat. The young woman hesitated at the edge. "Come with us," she said. "Go," he told her. "I'll find you when it's done." She wanted to argue, but saw the look in his eyes, the quiet resolve of someone who knew what he had to do. She nodded once and followed the others. Down into the shadows, the colonel's men reached the ridge just as the last of the settlers disappeared. Flames climbed the rocks, heat pressing against the warrior's skin. He took one last look at the burning canyon, then turned and ran toward the far side, where the river cut through stone. The colonel, realizing what was happening, shouted for his men to follow. The ground trembled as fire and water met, smoke twisting into the air like a warning. The warrior reached the edge of the cliff, the sound of rushing water below him. He could hear the colonel's voice behind him, closer now, filled with fury. The river roared beneath, wild and cold. He turned, his silhouette framed by the fire's glow, as the colonel appeared through the smoke with his revolver drawn. Their eyes locked again, and in that heartbeat, everything hung in balance: the war, the land, the people caught between them. The firelight flickered across their faces, and neither man moved. The storm was ready to break, but no one knew which way it would fall. The river roared below, wild and untamed, reflecting the firelight that burned across the canyon walls. The Apache warrior stood at the cliff's edge, breathing hard, his clothes torn and streaked with ash. Behind him, the colonel stepped through the smoke, revolver raised, his face dark with fury and exhaustion. The two men faced each other in silence, the fire's glow flickering between them like a heartbeat. The battle that had raged all day had come down to this: two men, bound by pride, purpose, and something deeper neither could name. "You can't run anymore," the colonel said, his voice rough from the smoke. "It ends here." The warrior didn't answer right away. He studied the man before him, seeing not the polished uniform or the polished medals, but the weariness in his eyes, the years of chasing something that no longer made sense. "It doesn't have to end with death," he said quietly. "You can still turn back." The colonel's jaw tightened. Turn back to what? A world that's slipping away? He gestured toward the canyon. "This land is changing whether you like it or not." I'm just the hand that finishes the work." "You're burning what you don't understand," the warrior replied. "And when it's gone, you'll have nothing left to fight for." For a moment, neither moved. The wind carried the crackle of the burning brush and the distant sound of the settlers escaping down the ravine. The colonel's hand trembled slightly on the revolver. He saw the fire, the smoke, the ruin his men had left behind. The words of the warrior struck something inside him that he hadn't wanted to field out. But pride was heavier than regret, and he raised the gun again. The warrior saw it coming before the shot rang out. He moved to the side, the bullet grazing his shoulder. Pain shot through him, but he didn't stop. He charged forward, grabbing the colonel's arm and twisting it hard. The gun fell to the ground, clattering against the rock. The two men struggled, each fueled by something beyond strength. The colonel fought for control, for the authority he believed gave him purpose. The warrior fought for life, for the people who still waited by the river's edge. The struggle ended when the colonel stumbled backward toward the cliff. His foot slipped on the loose gravel, and for a heartbeat he hung between balance and the void below. The warrior caught his wrist just as he began to fall. The colonel's eyes widened, filled with shock and disbelief. The firelight flickered across their faces, and in that moment, everything grew still. "You don't have to die," the warrior said, gripping tighter. "Let go of this fight." The colonel looked down at the raging water beneath them, then back at the man holding him. His expression softened, the fury draining from his face. "You should have been a soldier," he whispered. The warrior shook his head. "I am." For a second, it seemed the colonel might let himself be pulled up. But then he looked toward the burning canyon, the soldiers scattering in confusion, and something broke inside him. He gave a small, tired smile. "It's already gone." Before the warrior could react, the colonel let go. His hand slipped free, and he fell into the river below. The sound of rushing water swallowed everything. The warrior stood there, staring into the depths until the last ripple vanished. The fire crackled behind him, but the battle was over. By the time the smoke cleared, the army had retreated. The soldiers, leaderless and shaken, abandoned the canyon to the flames and followed the open plains north. The land they had tried to conquer turned against them, the fire spreading faster than they could control. The warrior descended the rocky slope, his wounded shoulder aching with every step, until he reached the riverbank where the others waited. The young woman was there, her eyes searching the smoke until she saw him. She ran to him, relief washing over her face. "You made it," she said breathlessly. He nodded, exhausted but standing. "It's done." The gray-haired man limped toward them, his rifle slung across his back. "The soldiers are gone," he said. "Some didn't even take their supplies. They just ran." He looked at the warrior with quiet respect. "You saved us." The warrior looked toward the canyon where the smoke still rose in dark curls. "No one was saved," he said softly. "Only spared." They made their way back to the ravine where the women and children had taken shelter. The little ones peeked out from behind the rocks, their faces streaked with dust and tears. When they saw their parents return, they ran forward, clinging to them. The air was heavy with relief and grief together. Some had lost family in the chaos. Others stared in silence, too stunned to speak. As night fell, the survivors gathered near the river. The fire from the canyon burned faintly in the distance, a dull orange glow against the dark sky. The warrior sat apart from the group, cleaning his wounds with river water. The young woman approached him with a piece of cloth and bound his shoulder carefully. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, she said, "He could have killed you. Why did you try to save him?" The warrior stared into the firelight, reflecting on the water. "Because mercy is what ends the war inside us," he said. "He was already lost. Killing him wouldn't have changed that." She nodded slowly, understanding. The gray-haired man joined them, sitting heavily on a stone. "What happens now?" he asked. The warrior looked toward the horizon, where the first stars began to appear. "You rebuild," he said. "The land will heal, but it will take time. Stay close to the river. It will keep you alive and you." The man asked. "I'll go where I'm needed," the warrior said. "There are others still caught in battles they didn't start. Maybe I can help them find peace before the fire reaches them too. The young woman looked at him with quiet sadness. You could stay, she said. You've earned rest. He gave a faint smile. Rest is for those who have finished their journey. Mine isn't done. The next morning the sun rose over the canyon, washing the burned land in light. The river shimmered as if nothing had happened. Its steady flow a reminder that nature endures even after men destroy what they can. The settlers began gathering what little they had left. Children carried baskets, women sorted supplies, and men started rebuilding makeshift shelters. Life was fragile, but it was still there. Before leaving, the warrior stood on the ridge once more. The wind brushed through his hair, carrying the scent of wet ash and wild sage. The canyon that had been a battlefield was quiet now, its silence both heavy and sacred. He thought of the colonel's final words, of the look in his eyes as he fell, and he felt no triumph, only understanding. Every war, no matter how righteous one side believes it to be, leaves behind emptiness. The young woman came to stand beside him. Will we ever see you again? She asked. He turned to her, his gaze calm. If the wind carries my path back this way, he said, take care of them. Keep the stories alive. The land remembers what men forget. She nodded, and for a moment neither spoke. The sound of the river filled the space between them, soft and endless. Then he turned and walked away, his figure growing smaller against the vast plains. The rising sun painted him in gold, and soon he was just a shadow moving toward the horizon. Days turned into weeks. The settlers slowly rebuilt their camp into a small village near the river. Crops began to sprout again, and laughter returned in small, cautious bursts. They honored those who had fallen and taught the children the names of those who had fought to protect them. The gray-haired man often told stories by the fire about the warrior who came when all hope was gone and left, without asking for anything, sometimes. At dawn, the young woman would walk to the ridge and look toward the open plains. She never saw him again, but she liked to think he was still out there, riding under the same sky, finding those who needed him. The wind that moved through the grass carried whispers of old songs, songs of courage, loss, and quiet strength. The canyon healed slowly. Grass grew over the burned ground, and the river's path carved new curves through the earth. The scars remained, but they became part of the story, a reminder of how close destruction had come, and how resilience had endured. In the end, the warrior's legacy wasn't in the battle he fought, but in what he left behind. Belief that survival isn't just about strength, but about mercy, unity, and hope. The settlers built their future from ashes, guided by the lesson he had given them, that even in a world of endless conflict, peace begins when one heart chooses not to hate. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the warrior rode beneath a wide and endless sky, the land stretching out before him, waiting for the next story that needed its ending.